Most people assume that following rules is a sign of maturity, that obedience reflects discipline, and that questioning authority is just rebellion dressed up as intellect. But psychology shows something far more interesting. The people who struggle most with blind compliance aren't troublemakers or contrarians. They're often the ones whose brains are literally wired to think in systems, to seek logic, and to resist anything that doesn't make structural sense. If you've ever felt frustrated by rules that seem arbitrary, if you've ever been called difficult simply for asking why, this video will explain exactly what's happening in your mind and why it's not a flaw. Your brain operates differently from most. Where others see a rule and accept it as fact, your mind automatically begins a process called analytical deconstruction. This is a cognitive function where the brain refuses to store information as a simple command and instead breaks it down into components, seeking the underlying logic, the historical context, and the potential consequences. For you, a rule isn't just a rule, it's a hypothesis that requires evidence. This isn't stubbornness, it's how your neural architecture processes authority. Your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for complex reasoning and decision-making, is more active during encounters with arbitrary instruction. While others experience compliance as neutral, your brain registers unexplained rules as incomplete data. And incomplete data triggers a mild but persistent cognitive discomfort that most people never feel. This brings us to something researchers call system-level thinking. Most people navigate the world by following surface patterns. They see that a rule exists, they follow it, and they move on. But your brain doesn't stop at the surface. It automatically maps the rule onto a larger framework, asking how this connects to other systems, whether the logic is internally consistent, and what happens when the rule is applied to edge cases. This is exhausting for you, but it's also why you often see flaws that others miss entirely. You're not being critical for the sake of it. Your brain is running quality control on systems that most people accept without inspection. The problem is that society rarely rewards this. In rigid environments, whether in school, corporate settings, or social structures, the person who points out the flaw in the system is often treated as the problem rather than the system itself. There's an evolutionary reason for this cognitive pattern, and understanding it might help you feel less broken. In ancestral environments, the individuals who questioned group decisions and analyzed risks before acting served a crucial survival function. They were the ones who asked whether the new water source was actually safe, whether the migration path made sense, or whether the leader's strategy would get everyone killed. These early skeptics weren't popular, but they kept the tribe alive. Your brain carries this same operating system. You're wired to question because, at some deep neurological level, unexamined action registers as danger. When someone tells you to do something without explaining why, your threat detection system activates, not dramatically, but enough to make compliance feel wrong. You're not being difficult. You're running a program designed to keep you and those around you safe from poorly reasoned decisions. Now, here's where things become socially complicated. Most environments operate on what psychologists call hierarchical compliance norms. This means that the expectation isn't just that you follow rules, but that you follow them without visible hesitation. The appearance of obedience is often more valued than the quality of the outcome. For someone with your cognitive wiring, this creates a constant, low-level friction. You can follow the rule, but your brain won't let you do it smoothly. There's always that pause, that flicker of analysis, that moment where you're processing whether this makes sense. And that pause, even when you ultimately comply, gets read by others as resistance, arrogance, or insubordination. You've probably been told you have an attitude problem, when really you just have a processing difference. Your brain requires a few extra milliseconds to run the logic check. And in environments that demand instant, unquestioning obedience, those milliseconds cost you. Let's talk about what happens internally when you're forced to comply with something that doesn't make sense. Your brain experiences what researchers call cognitive dissonance under constraint. This occurs when you're required to act in a way that contradicts your own logical assessment. For most people, this dissonance is mild or absent because they haven't deeply analyzed the rule in the first place. But you have. You've already identified the flaw, predicted the suboptimal outcome, and calculated a better approach. Being forced to proceed anyway creates a specific kind of psychological stress. It's not about ego, it's about being asked to act against your own processing. Over time, this repeated dissonance can lead to chronic frustration, disengagement, or the sense that you're constantly performing a version of compliance that feels inauthentic. You're not imagining this discomfort. It's a predictable neurological response to being forced to operate against your own cognitive architecture. If this is resonating with you, if you're recognizing patterns you've never had words for, consider subscribing. There's more content coming that will help you understand why your mind works the way it does and how to work with it instead of against it. Here's something that might reframe your entire relationship with authority. Your struggle with blind obedience is actually a form of intellectual integrity. You cannot separate your sense of truth from your sense of action. When something doesn't make logical sense, acting as if it does feels like a form of internal dishonesty. This is called Cognitive-Behavioural Alignment, and it's more pronounced in people with higher analytical ability. For you, doing something you know is illogical isn't just uncomfortable, it feels almost morally wrong, even when the stakes are low. This is why you can't just let things go the way others can. It's not that you want to be difficult, it's that your brain won't allow you to partition your understanding from your behavior. What you know and what you do have to match, or something inside you protests. There's another layer to this that rarely gets discussed. People with your cognitive profile often experience what I call authority pattern recognition. You don't just question individual rules, you start to notice patterns in how rules are created, enforced, and justified. You see when rules are designed to protect power rather than serve function. You notice when explanations are circular or when compliance is demanded precisely because the reasoning wouldn't survive scrutiny. This pattern recognition is valuable, even essential, in contexts like research, innovation, and ethical leadership. But in everyday hierarchical structures, it makes you exhausting to manage. You see too much, you connect too many dots, and those who benefit from unexamined systems would often prefer you simply didn't. Let's address something you may have experienced your entire life: being called difficult, rebellious, or having an attitude, not because you were actively causing problems, but because you asked questions. Psychological research shows that in conformity-driven environments, the act of questioning alone is perceived as a threat, regardless of the questioner's intent or the validity of the question. Your brain's natural tendency to seek understanding before compliance gets coded as defiance. And because this has happened repeatedly, you may have learned to either suppress your questions entirely or brace yourself for conflict every time you open your mouth. Neither of these is healthy. The suppression leads to resentment and disengagement. The constant bracing leads to social exhaustion. You've been forced to develop defense mechanisms for a cognitive trait that in the right environment would be considered an asset. This is why environment matters so much for people like you. In rigid, compliance-first structures, your analytical nature is a liability. You'll constantly be swimming against the current, expending energy just to exist without friction. But in environments that value innovation, critical thinking, and genuine problem solving, the same trait that got you labeled as difficult becomes your greatest contribution. The people who question systems are the ones who improve them. The people who refuse to accept "because I said so" are the ones who eventually build better alternatives. Your brain isn't malfunctioning. It's optimized for a different kind of environment than the one you may have been forced to operate in. Here's the psychological reframe that changes everything. You don't struggle with rules, you struggle with arbitrary rules. Give you a regulation that has clear logic, that produces measurable benefit, that connects to a coherent system of values, and you'll likely follow it more precisely than anyone else. Your compliance isn't broken, it's conditional on quality. You're not incapable of structure. You're incapable of pretending that bad structure is acceptable. This distinction is crucial because it means the problem isn't you. The problem is the mismatch between your cognitive needs and the intellectual laziness of many institutional environments. You were built to thrive in systems that make sense. When the system doesn't make sense, the friction you feel is appropriate. Let's talk about what happens when you finally find yourself in an environment that values what you offer. Suddenly, the trait that was a burden becomes a superpower. Your questions become contributions. Your inability to accept the status quo becomes the engine for improvement. Your demand for logic becomes the quality control that everyone benefits from. People who spent years feeling broken often describe entering the right environment as feeling like they can finally breathe. Not because they changed, but because the context changed. If you haven't found this environment yet, know that it exists. And knowing what you need allows you to actively seek it, rather than continuously trying to contort yourself into spaces that were never designed for minds like yours. You've probably spent years receiving the message that you're too much, too questioning, too unwilling to just go along. But what if that resistance was never a flaw? What if your brain was engineered for depth, for logic, for understanding before action? The struggle you feel when confronted with arbitrary authority isn't dysfunction. It's the friction of a high-performance mind being asked to run inefficient code. You don't need to fix this about yourself. You need to understand it, work with it, and find or create contexts where it's valued. If this helped you see yourself differently, subscribe. There's more content coming that will help you understand how your mind actually works. And I want to know, which of these points hit the hardest? Drop a number in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.